If you thought the last unit was long, wait till you see this one. So we're going to go from the Gilded Age all the way through World War II and the many, many changes that took place in America. So let's get started. The first topic we're going to talk about is the progressives. So progressives, very simply defined, is people who favor reform. Now that doesn't mean they're always honest about it. Sometimes they do it a little bit deviously, but it is a group of people who are fighting for equality in America for some specific group or maybe several groups. So let's start with progressives and race. Let's take a step back for a minute and talk about the amendments that were created directly for Black Americans. And so the 13th, of course, will free them from slavery. The 14th will make them all citizens. And the 15th will give Black men the right to vote. So now you have a whole new problem. It's not just that you have a giant group of people newly freed looking for jobs. You have a giant group of people who have the right to vote and another giant group that doesn't want them to have that right. So different states are going to come up with many different tricks to keep Black people from voting and or Black men from voting, and these are the top three that were used across the South especially. Poll tax was a tax charged for you to walk up and say, I vote this way, I vote that way. So back then it was $2. Today it would be $35. As low as our voter turnout is today, can you imagine what it would be if you had to pay to vote? $35. This is the one that will upset whites because it is so expensive, it takes the right to vote away from poor whites as well. So that's going to upset them. The grandfather clause is the trickiest one of all. It said that you had to have a ancestor that voted in the 1867 election in order for you to be able to vote. The problem with that is that Black men did not get their right to vote until 1870. So there's no way they had an ancestor voting in 1867. So that whenever it was used eliminated all Black men. The last one is the literacy test. And I don't mean this was just a here, read this little passage. It was a confusing, horrible test. So one that could not be passed by anyone, white, black, or purple. So all three of these ways are ones you need to know because they are the evils that existed during the time to keep men from their right to vote. And you can see the picture up here. I love this. Black men must be educated and the white guy spelling it wrong. Love that. So let's talk about how people mostly in the South, but not just in the South. Don't forget there are Northerners and Westerners that are racist as well. Jim Crow is that method of keeping freedmen in line, in quotes, keeping them where they wanted them, making sure that they're not going to get ahead, making sure that they're not going to be the ones that are going to be allowed to make major decisions. And so here's some of the side effects of Jim Crow. Of course, you know segregation. You've been learning about that since you were a little kid. But the growth of the KKK is a really big deal. This is that time period where if someone didn't like you because of your color or because you were mixing with the opposite color too much, the KKK would put a cross on your front door, maybe put a coffin in your front yard and set it on fire, that kind of stuff. It also, through Jim Crow, gave the right of ordinary citizens to hang African Americans for basically nothing. If a white person said this individual, especially a black man, needs to die, then that's what happened. So lynching was almost always a mob event where you had large numbers go capture this innocent, most often black individual, and hang them or burn them. But hanging was the kind of the thing of the day. So there is going to be, of course, individuals that are going to go against Jim Crow. And the first one we're going to learn about is a man by the name of Homer Plessy. So Homer Plessy lived in Louisiana and he decided to test the Jim Crow laws about segregation on the trains. And so Homer Plessy refuses to sit where he's supposed to sit on a train. He sits in the white section. And of course, a big deal is made about it. And he is thrown from the train. So, not thrown, but he's kicked off the train. So, it's going to make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the judge in charge of this case, which will become known as Plessy versus Ferguson, um, Ferguson is the judge, so that's where we get the name from. Homer Plessy is the black individual that tested the Jim Crow law. Ferguson is the one who made this very, very evil doctrine, put it in the law books through the Supreme Court, which meant it was in stone, and that doctrine is called separate but equal. After that, it was legal to separate everything you can think of. This is where you get the separation of pools. This is where you get the separation of restaurants, waiting rooms, doors, windows. Everything was coded by color, and it was perfectly legal because of Ferguson's decision in the separate but equal doctrine. So this is the first case to make Jim Crow actual law. So within a year, everything is separate, yes, but it will never, ever, ever, in any case, be equal. Make sure you understand that. It is never equal. So, a very evil doctrine that's going to last for a really long time. Let's look at another individual who did a lot for black rights. He was probably one of the most controversial figures. His name is Booker T. Washington. I'm sure you've heard his name before. And probably the most famous thing that he did during that time was a speech called the Atlanta Compromise. And so it's in Atlanta, Georgia. And in that speech, he asked black individuals to cast down their bucket. So here's the story behind that. The Cast Down Your Bucket was a story that he told about two ships. One was in peril. The people on board were dying of thirst, and this second ship comes across and says, um, cast down your bucket, cast down your bucket. And the ship in peril says, no, we need fresh water. Our men are dying. We can't cast down our bucket. You can't drink salt water. We will not cast it down. And the second ship said, cast down your bucket. And the ship in peril said, no, we will not. So after this going back and forth for several hours, the ship in peril, the guys on board get upset and say, fine, we'll cast down our bucket. And so they cast down the bucket, they pull the bucket up, and lo and behold, they had been sitting in fresh water for weeks. So Booker T. Washington is saying to black individuals, cast down your bucket where you are. Everything you need is here. Stop migrating to the north, stop migrating to the west. Cast down your bucket where you are. Here is your salvation. So that might not have been too horrible, and people, especially the black community, might have been able to deal with that. Sounds like a logical thing, but what's that compromise? The compromise is basically Booker telling blacks to accept segregation, to accept the fact that they will never be equal to whites, and just get over it. So a lot of blacks saw him as kind of a traitor to their race. He promoted the idea that blacks should be of service to whites and be so good at their jobs. Now, these are going to be menial jobs. Well, not all of them. I shouldn't say menial jobs because you do have a lot of black farmers. But farmers, servants kind of jobs. He said be so good at those jobs that you're better than any white has ever been, and the white community will see you as useful, and discrimination will die off. So be the best that you can be where you are, cast down that bucket, but accept the fact that you will never be superior or even equal to whites ever. So that's a lot to deal with. Whites loved him. Whites definitely trusted him. He opened a vocational school with government help in Mississippi called the Tuskegee Institute. And this institute taught men and women, black men and women, the things you see in front of you: farming, mechanics, domestic servitude. So, not all menial. Farmers and mechanics definitely aren't menial kind of jobs, but you're not going to be that a black farmer that owns, this giant plantation type of place in the South. But you were supposed to be super good at farming. And the men and women that came out of there were good at what they did. I read a story one time about a farmer who who had learned at, at this school to taste the dirt. And when there was a certain tang in the dirt, it meant that it was time to plant. And the guy was never wrong. Like he learned this at the school. So I don't know if that's true, but they did become experts in their field. So again, the whites really trusted Booker. Uh, Blacks are kind of half and half. Again, some of them saw him as a traitor. Some of them saw him as just he's being logical. This is our world now. So the black community was really torn apart over how to feel about Booker. Now he actually kind of invaded the White House under Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt asked him to meet with him, and Booker showed up at the White House. Now this is kind of still a no-no. Remember when Lincoln met with Frederick Douglass, they did not meet in the White House. They met outside on the lawn or on the porch. So this is the second black individual ever to make it to the door of the White House. So he's actually invited in, and yes, it did cause an uproar. Teddy got a lot of slack for it, but Teddy was a big bear of a man and didn't really care. So Booker broke that barrier that yes, black individuals will be invited to the White House, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm the president. So Teddy told everybody what for. Now, I do want to tell you a kind of secret side to Booker. Booker publicly said, cast down your bucket, accept the fact that we're going to be inferior. But behind closed doors, he actually financed a lot of cases about that had something to do with racism. So he was behind closed doors helping people that got in trouble because of racist whites, and people didn't know about it. So he was kind of that secret guy behind the doors. So he's a really confusing figure, but that's Booker. So let's look at his arch enemy next. Oh, I forgot. I was going to show you pictures of the Tuskegee Institute. So we'll get to his arch enemy in a minute. So this is what it looked like. He helped design it so that when students were traveling from place to place, they had to go by certain statues to get to different buildings that were used quite often, like where they ate and things like that, so that you would remember what the school was about. And notice the statue here. You have this guy who is not well clothed, and Booker is there behind him with the coat. You see from the side there is also a plow. They're sitting on a plow. So statues like that was supposed to help the black community remember why they're there. We're here for to learn, to fit into the community and be a valued member of the community. And notice in the picture there are a couple of whites in here, so it's not an completely run by all blacks. And that was also Booker's idea too, that you allow some whites to work there. He thought that that would alleviate some racism. So Tuskegee Institute, it's still there. It was used for years for many different things. You've heard the Tuskegee Airmen. That's not too far down the road, and that kind of came out of that Tuskegee Institute. We'll talk about the Tuskegee Airmen in this unit as well. So make sure you know that that is the school that was opened by Booker T. Now let's talk about his arch enemy. Yeah, and I'm not even tired. This is early in the morning. All right, so Du Bois had a very different way of looking at segregation and racism than Booker did. So W.B. Du Bois, rather than saying cast down your bucket, he was constantly saying fight against the veil. He said there was a veil between the races, and although he knew that it was never going to go away, that you should never stop fighting against it. So he completely opposed Booker and said, our people do not need to learn vocational learning. We need to learn book learning so that when somebody is treating us badly or cheating us, we actually know that we're being cheated. And so Du Bois had he had some things happen in his life that made him not happy about whites and the way that they were treated more significantly than other black individuals. And one of the cases is he met a woman, fell in love with her, and Du Bois and this woman both have white blood in them. And so they had a baby, and the baby had blonde hair, and flecks of green and blue in his eyes, and was very obviously a mixed child. And so this child gets sick, and he even says he didn't want to love it because it was a white baby. He didn't want to love it, but he couldn't help it. He loved his wife, and so through her he came to love this child more than himself. And so the child got sick. He took the child to a hospital. It was an all white hospital. They did not allow him in because he was black, and so the baby died. And Du Bois could never get past that. He could never get past that. And if you ever read his book, The Souls of Black Folk, that I have over here, it's a wonderful book. But you can definitely hear the anger coming out in his voice in the book. And you can't blame him. But he's just never going to get past that. And so he's okay with violence. Booker's not. And he says book learning over vocational learning. Now, in 1909, he's one of the few black individuals that come together to create the organization we now know as the NAACP. And this is still around today. It's still very, very powerful. And it is to fight segregation and inequality. So NAACP definitely became a force to reckon with. And this is Du Bois's baby. There were three people that got together and created this idea, and he was one of the three. So make sure you know him for that, and make sure you know the difference between him and Booker, the book learning versus the vocational learning. And of course, I got to throw a lady in there. You know I do. And that would be Ida B. Wells. So, Ida B. Wells is, here's her claim to fame, the right to fight. So, she had a newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, and she was living in kind of a larger community in Memphis, and she had a very good friend, well, actually three very good friends that had opened up a grocery store in Memphis, and they're black. They were doing really, really well, and the white grocers in the neighborhood got jealous. And guess what? Somehow, some way, those three black grocery men were accused of a crime, and all three of them were hung. And Ida was furious. These were her friends. So, and she knew that it was only because they were jealous and didn't want black men making more money than them. And so she went back to her Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, and she wrote an article about it. She told the facts of it, the true facts of it, and she named names. She was not afraid to name names. So her newspaper was burned down. Isn't that a big coincidence? But guess what? She just started writing it out of her house. She was not going to back down. She was not going to back down. She went to DC often and argued with presidents face to face. In 1884, she was on a train. She was very, very pregnant. She was going to go to DC again to fight and trying to get laws, anti-lynching laws. And she was 9 months pregnant, due to have that baby any day. She was a teeny tiny woman, like 5 foot tall. And she was sitting in the black car, which was also the smoking car. And being 9 months pregnant, the smoke was making her sick. So she got up and moved to the white car that wasn't smoking. And of course, she got in trouble for it, and they tried to escort her back to the train car she was supposed to be in, and she fought them. They stopped the train. They tried to get her off. It took 6 men to get a 5 foot tall, 9 month pregnant woman off that train. She sued the train company, and guess what? She won. She was that convincing. Even in this time period, she won and actually got some money from the train company. So make sure you know her for that. So she's one among the many people, Plessy included, that refused to sit where they were supposed to sit. So when we talk about Rosa Parks later, just keep in mind that she was not the first. That doesn't make her any less brave, but she was not the first. This is kind of a an activity that people will use to promote the idea of change, not sitting where you're supposed to sit. And so also make sure that you know her Memphis Free Speech and Headlight became an anti-lynching newspaper. That's what it became about. And whenever she heard of violence associated with lynching and black individuals, she published it. Now, she was friends with both Booker and Du Bois. She liked both of them for different reasons and often got stuck in the middle between the two of them. But she is asked by Du Bois to join the NAACP, and she does. So she's one of the three that are going to start this very powerful organization. She's a very powerful little lady, and she actually did cut down the number of lynchings in the South in a huge way. So she was very, very much responsible for making change in the South. So before I show you some maps about how many lynchings were taking place, I want you to see the ridiculousness of this. Here's legal reasons. See that word, legal? Underline that in your notes. Legal reasons for lynching a black individual, especially a black man. So look at this. Voodooism, trying to vote, mistaken identity. Oh, sorry, we got the wrong guy. We hung him. Oh, sorry, it's a done deal. Entering the same room as a white woman, frightening a white woman. Come on, come on. But this is all legal. It's all legal. And the one there at the top, our second row down, insulting a white, could just be nothing more than a look. You looked at me wrong, and you're black and I'm white, so now you have to hang. So you should see the ridiculousness of it. Here you see some horrific evidence of what Jim Crow allowed whites to do to blacks, especially in the South. Notice that there are children in the crowd. Notice that there are people laughing, that they think that this is entertainment. This was the way of the world in the South back then. As a black individual, you had to fear for your life, truly fear for your life. So, lynching was the most common form of murdering these innocent victims. Sometimes they were burned. Sometimes you see the bottom picture here where they were hung and burned. And it was not always just men. Mostly it was men, but women were hung as well. And this lady that you see in the bottom right hand corner, her name is Elizabeth Lawrence. And Elizabeth Lawrence was killed, lynched, because she had the nerve to tell a couple little white boys who were throwing stones at her to stop throwing the stones. And so that night, there was a knock on her door, and when she opened it, it was a mob there to take her out into the forest and lynch her. So, just a ugly scar in American history. And here's the map that you can see, indicates from 1882 to 1968. 1968 still had lynchings going on. So you can see the prominent places where it happened. If you look at the very first map of the entire United States, you can see the key places where hanging took place, and then I individualized it. So you've got Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi being some of the worst places for lynchings to take place. Just horrible, horrible, horrible scar on our history. So there are many other issues that progressives are going to try to fix as well besides race issues. One of the big ones of the time, of course, is in labor. Don't forget, this is on the heel of the Triangle Factory where 146 girls were killed. So here's some things that they're working to make better for people: unsafe working conditions, child labor, yada yada. And they're also trying to get equality for not just women and blacks, but for the poor. And one of the places that you had to really pay attention to in the time period as far as poor people are the company towns, where the company owned everything, and anyone living there and working there rented everything from the company. So let's look a little bit at how the different ethnic groups were treated in company towns. So in company towns, you had a company store right in the dead center of the town. And in the company store, there was a placard on the wall that told you exactly what pay you would get for your nationality and how much rent you would be charged. So they were not secretly being unequal in treatment, they were very open about it. So notice that the English guys are going to have the most pay and kind of the middle of the road rent. Look at the Slavic people and the Italian people. So these guys are going to have less pay and the highest rents. So there's three major groups that were working in these company towns, and company towns are associated with mines of some kind, whether it's coal or lime or whatever else you can think of. It's a company town is a mining company. So the mining company owned the town, every building in it, and the men and women who worked for the mining companies lived in rented houses from the company. Everything they needed, everything from blankets to food supplies to kerosene, everything came from that company store where they would have this placard about your pay and your rent. So they didn't have to pay you cash. There was no law saying they had to pay you cash. They paid you in something called script. So script was basically an IOU, and that way you could never leave. You even rented the tools that you worked with. Like you were completely in debt to this company. So let's get back to the three major groups. You see six groups here, but I want to talk about the three major groups. So Italians were put in mines. Italians are not going to be allowed to work in factories because Italians have that stereotype during the time as being violent. So let's put them underground where they can't cause any damage. The Poles as well. That's another of the three major groups. Poles back then had a stereotype of being stupid. They couldn't learn how to work in a factory and not get somebody hurt or break machinery was the thought of the day. Not right, but it was a thought of the day. And then the third very large group was Slavic people. Slavic people were considered dirty and not well respected. And so let's put them, we don't want to put them in a factory because they smell, they're dirty, they don't take care of themselves at all. We'll put them underground where no one cares what they smell like. So those three groups, and again, not true. Well, not true. Italian, Polish, and Slavic are the three groups that are going to be most prominent in these company towns. And again, the treatment is horrible, the houses are horrible, it's filthy, nasty, dirty, and you're stuck there. Once you become a worker in a company town, you're stuck there. So there are progressives that are going to try and change things in these company towns so the poor people working for script can get out from underneath of all of that. There's also problems in cities. So you have urban issues, and you see all these are pretty logical, but these are problems that progressives will try and fix as well. Just take a freeze it and write the list. And we'll come back to those urban issues more later, but let's move on to another problem that was being felt across the United States, and that was drinking alcohol. Many groups had decided that there was an honest to goodness link between alcohol use and family abuse, and so people are going to try and outlaw alcohol to get rid of that. And one of the number one groups involved in this, not the only one, but one of the number one groups in getting prohibition accomplished was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, make sure you know the founder of that union was Frances Willard. But Frances was not the most famous of the members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The most famous would be Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation married a man when she was very young, and her family didn't like the man. They told her he had a problem with alcohol, but she was in love, and so she married him. And he indeed did have a problem with alcohol, beat her quite often, and she does end up divorcing him. She marries a minister the second time around, thinking, he'll be a good, sweet soul. He also had a problem with alcohol. Not, he didn't beat her, but he did drink too much. And so she kind of feels like she needs to do something about this. That here's two men in her life, two marriages, both interrupted with alcohol. So Carrie begins this plan to go down to the local saloon, and she would hang outside and she would say nasty things to people as they were entering, like the things you see in front of you. Good morning, destroyer of men's souls. She would say that to the bartenders. Or, I want all hellions to quit puffing that hell fume in God's clean air. She's talking about the cigars that are associated with the bar. She was just in there in people's faces, constantly at them, and she felt like she wasn't getting anything done. So she decided to go to a local bar and start breaking things. And she did. And she really did some serious damage to the local bar, breaking things, breaking windows. And so she goes home that night, and that very night, a tornado comes through the town and completely destroys the bar and a lot of other buildings. But she took it as a sign from God that God agreed with her that she should keep doing this. And so she starts traveling through Kansas and other places, destroying bars. And after one particularly public this bout of destruction, her husband, the preacher, says to her, "Why don't you just take a hatchet and be done with it? Just, break everything in your path. You need a hatchet." And she said to him, "That is the smartest thing you've ever said to me. Actually, the only smart thing you've ever said to me." And so the very next day, she went and bought a hatchet, and that became her new thing. She would take this hatchet with her everywhere she went, and that's how she destroyed the bars. She divorces husband number two as well. Bars, she was super well known, especially in the South, especially in Kansas. And bars would hang signs up saying every nation welcome except Carrie Nation and things like that. So she was a real thorn in the side of people who owned bars or ran bars. So prohibition, of course, will be made a thing by the 18th Amendment. Now, she's going to die in 1911, so she does not actually get to see her plan come to fruition with the 18th Amendment, and neither does Frances Willard. But Carrie Nation's actions definitely did convince people that women were a force to be reckoned with and that maybe we should start listening. So she and Frances Willard both helped promote the idea of prohibition and got that 18th Amendment passed, even though neither one of them actually got to see it because they both passed away. Don't forget, 18th Amendment, prohibition, 21st Amendment does away with it. So make sure you know those two. And here, just to reiterate it, 18th Amendment was passed in 1919. Carey died in 1911. I think Willard died in 1911 as well. But both of them gone before it was passed. But it does pass, and it's a huge failure. I love some of these pictures, though, of these guys dumping out their liquor here over on the right-hand side. It's a huge failure. People just turn to the black market, and so it leads to an increase in crime. It definitely does not do away with spousal abuse. Men find ways to drink, so do women. So it is a huge failure, and because of that, doesn't last very long. It's passed in 1919 under the 18th Amendment and repealed in 1933. And I love the sign "Farewell 18th Amendment." So you had all these secret places that were drinking the entire time, but now they're allowed to do it out in the open. Look at the giant glasses of liquor that these people have to celebrate the death of the 18th Amendment. So again, one more time. 18th prohibition, 21st did away with it. So let's look at what's happening in the government. These are progressive accomplishments. So in the local government, they created something called the City Commission. And this was a board elected to run the citizen. These are not, or the city, they are not politicians. This is average, everyday people that most often have some kind of vested interest in what's happening in the city. So it might be store owners that are elected to run the city, but they're not politicians. That's really important and that's key. So they can't be bribed because they're not in the political realm. They're not going to be voted on because they're Republican or Democrat. They're going to be voted on because they are educated in the problems of the city and thought that maybe they could help out. So City commission is a brand new idea. City manager, they are elected by that commission that is not political. And the city manager has to be an expert in something to do with city planning. Usually there's an engineering degree involved in it, even today. So a city manager is the one that's going to help decide how many extra buildings they can have, including home developments. They're the ones that figure that out. Can our town, our water supply, or electric supply handle new buildings and how many, that kind of thing. So your city manager has to be an expert in some type of field that will relate to that, most often, again, in engineering. So, city commission elected by the people, city manager elected by the city commission. In state, we have a couple ways of fixing problems, and one of them is called a referendum. And a referendum is called when voters are asked to meet and discuss a bill and vote whether they think that that bill should be passed. And I'll give you a really good example. When I lived in North Carolina, they were talking about having year-round school. So in every county that it was affecting, it was like this slow crawl. You could see it coming towards us, on the map. So in my county, in Carteret County, they decided to hold a referendum, invite the public to talk about it, what would it look like, and for all of us to vote on it. So we did. We held a meeting. The politicians looked at our voting results. It was almost unanimously against year-round school, but guess what? Year-round school became a thing. So referendums are a way for voters to go speak their mind and let the politicians know firsthand how they feel about something. Doesn't mean it's going to change the mind of the politicians or the way that things are done, but at least it gives local voters a voice, an actual voice where you can go speak, not just a piece of paper you write on, but you can actually speak. And sometimes it does sway politicians. So it's a good thing. I don't want to make it sound like it's useless, because sometimes it does good. They also invented something called recall, where you can remove a public official. Basically, that's an impeachment and removal on a lower level. So, the best example I can think of is the California governor. At one point, did some pretty wicked things, and so his position was recalled. He was fired, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger was allowed to come in and take his place as the governor of California. So, you can recall or dismiss a public official. There's also a new thing called an initiative, where a voter, a simple voter, not a politician, can introduce or propose a bill to Congress, and it can be anyone of any age, gender, color, just a citizen that says, "Here's an idea I have for a new bill." And again, as an example, I have a friend whose daughter was killed at a railroad crossing, because, and it was linked to the fact that there were no lights, no warning system that a train was coming. She had the radio up super high, never knew what hit her. And so her mother, in her sorrow, created a bill called Lights and Gates for 50 states. Now, her mother was uneducated. The highest grade she ever went to was the sixth grade. She had this daughter when she was 16 years old. So you kind of get the idea of her position in society. But yet, she created this initiative for Lights and Gates for 50 states, and it made it through. And so I think it's by the year 2022 we're supposed to have lights and gates at every crossing in America. Is that going to happen? Who knows? It's pretty expensive, but the point is that a simple woman with no experience in the political realm created an initiative that made it all the way to Congress. So pretty impressive. Progressives also made major changes in elections. So, the 17th Amendment, we, for the first time in America, were allowed to directly vote for our senators. So, every vote does matter, every vote is counted, and so we directly elect the people who will represent us in the Senate. By 1892, every state in the Union was using secret ballots. That was actually an idea that Australia created, where you went in secret and wrote down your candidate. So no longer after 1892 are you supposed to have that walk up to the table and say, "I vote Republican, vote Democrat." It was done in secret, and that's supposed to help get more voters out. It's supposed to protect black voters. It's supposed to protect everybody. So, does it always work? No, but it's a huge step in the right direction. So, secret ballots. We also started using primary elections. It used to be where party leaders were kind of decided by rich men in a dark, smoke filled room, and whoever would be their their best pawn would be the party candidate. But we're not doing that anymore. There are primary elections now. So voters select the candidates from their party instead of the party leaders. So you can see 17th Amendment, secret ballot, more people voting because of that. And then the primary elections, everyday citizens have a much louder voice in politics because of the progressives. I know I'm going through the topics pretty fast, but progressives did a lot, so we have to talk about a lot of different things. Big business was a problem during this time period too, because we have the first millionaires and billionaires through big business, and these big business guys were buying up everything and dominating the market and running out the little mom and pop shops out of business. And so the government decides to step in through progressive actions and break up these giant monopolies. And one of the first ways that was tried or attempted was the creation of antitrust laws. So the first antitrust law is going to be the Sherman antitrust law, and it was a complete failure. Basically, it does exactly what you see here. You can't have a trust. We talked about trust. Many people that have monopolies and were told to break them up turn to that trust where the same men were on multiple boards of multiple businesses and they were still controlling that one business. So if you have 15 shoe factories in one town, the same men are sitting on the board of all 15. So it really still is a monopoly, but it doesn't look like it on paper. So this is what's supposed to be breaking them up, that antitrust law. You're not allowed to have a trust anymore where the same guys are sitting on the same boards. So Sherman antitrust was an attempt to break up all those trusts, which really are monopolies. The problem is it was used against the unions. The wording of it was really vague, and so it was ended up being used against the unions, and people were claiming that unions were a monopoly or a trust and they were trying to break them up, and that was not the intention. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to be reworked by Woodrow Wilson. Yes, you need to know Woodrow Wilson, not my favorite president, but he did do some things good. He reworked or expanded the Sherman Antitrust, renamed it the Clayton Antitrust, and in it, it specifically exempts unions. It says unions have nothing to do with this act, and it also specifically outlaws price fixing in any way whatsoever. So the Clayton Antitrust Act was much more successful than the Sherman Antitrust in breaking up those evil trusts. So we're leaving the government stuff. I know you're really upset about that. Let's get back to the individuals that the progressives are trying to help. And so the next topic is children and the poor. It became the way of most societies in this time period, and we're talking about the change of the century here, where they created something in society called the social gospel through the churches. And this was a really big prominent thing among mostly Protestant ministers, but Catholics were doing it too. I don't want to make it sound like the Protestants were the good guys, but it's mostly a Protestant thing, and they used something called applied Christianity. And the social gospel meant that they used biblical examples to get society to believe that the Bible was directing us to save the children, save the poor, and all good Christians would do what they could to do that. The applied Christianity also was on board with prohibition, so a lot of these Protestant ministers supported that as well. But the big thing of it is we have to take care of the children and the poor. And so through these churches, many settlement houses were created. And these are places, church funded very often, where the housing, food, classes for the kids, child care while mom, especially single moms, are at work. So settlement houses were very often church affiliated, but not always. Sometimes it was just purely secular. So it could go either way. It's going to start in the churches and then it's going to expand into the secular world as well. So these settlement houses are going to help the children and the poor, especially immigrants. They were a big group that's helped by the settlement houses. You taught them English, taught them the ways of American life, and again, child care was a big thing so that women could go work. Settlement houses clauses will also encourage government reforms when it comes to the working class. And most of these settlement houses in the end are going to be staffed by college educated middle class women. So here is a new place for college educated women who at the time are still being looked down upon. If you're an educated woman, there probably is something wrong with you. Women aren't supposed to want a high education. And so these ladies didn't always have a place to go, but now they do. So they staff settlement houses very, very often. The number one example I can give you of that is a place called Hull House in Chicago, and that was opened and operated by a great woman by the name of Jane Addams. So, Hull House is a settlement house opened and operated by Jane Addams. Let's look at that a little more closely. So here's some beautiful pictures of the Chicago Hall House with Jane Addams. Her focus was residence for people, research on how to help people more, how to educate them better, how to make them independent, and of course, reform. So, reform as far as like the legal things. What can she do in the law realm to help these poor people? So she also created the idea of the new woman, and again, it's women that are working in these settlement houses helping people. So she opens Hull House in 1889. Look at the statistic here. By 1920, there were 500 of them in the United States. That's a big, big change in 30 years. So Jane is such an interesting person. I'm going to let you listen to a video clip of a woman that's going to tell you the story of Jane Addams. She's actually literally going to read a story to you, but it's all true. And yes, I do want you to take notes. So watch that video and then we'll move on to the next topic. But Jane Addams, she was fantastic. You know you love that story. So let's take a look at women in the working realm. Progressives are going to demand change, of course, and progressives are most often, I hate to say this, but they are most often women. And I don't want it to sound like men don't care, but women are the ones that need the change the most. So women progressives are pretty dominant. So let's see what they're fighting for themselves. First of all, they want minimum wage, and this one wasn't really thought through very well. So it's not so much of a success. Minimum wage was attached to how many hours women could work as well. So in most cases, women were only allowed to work 8 hours when laws came out state by state. And so if a company needed a woman longer than or a worker longer than 8 hours and they couldn't do that anymore, if you were a female, then females were fired. They also said that minimum wage was going to be 25 cents. So a lot of places for a female, a lot of places said that females aren't worth 25 cents. They fired them and they hired men. Some places that employed women had already been paying them more than 25 cents. And so now with this new law, they are going to lose pay. So if they were making 30 cents, now they're going to make 25 cents. So there was a lot of extenuating circumstances that nobody really thought about. And so this idea of minimum wage actually hurt women. Not to mention, too, that there are studies that are going to come out about women's health and working. And you see this statement here: long hours are more disastrous to the health of women than to men. Government therefore needs to regulate hours for the health, safety, morals, and general welfare of women. So women are the only ones that are being told that they can only work the 8 hours because of these stupid scientific studies. So not only are places, again, like I said, not allowing women to work at jobs they needed them for more than 8 hours, but if you're at a job that you used to be able to get 10 hours a day and now you can only get 8, even if the boss allows it, you've just cut your pay. So if you're a single woman, you're going to end up losing money. So none of it really worked out the way that women wanted it to. Now, divorce is going to be a pretty rampant thing. during the change of the century, and so much so that Teddy Roosevelt said that we were in danger of losing the white race because it was whites that were getting divorced and not having babies. And so he made some divorce laws that made it tougher for you to get a divorce, made you think about it harder. And so there were a couple states like the Dakotas where you could literally go get a divorce in 5 minutes. But Teddy made it harder for you to get a divorce, so you had to think about it. So I don't know if you consider that a success or not. Nowadays, about 50% of marriages end in divorce. It is getting better. One of the things that may be making it better is that people are getting married older. So instead of marrying at, 18, 19, 20 years old, they're waiting till their late 20s, early 30s. So that may be why, like, they're more sure they know what love really is. So who knows? The divorce laws that Teddy created, we don't really know. Was it a success or not? I guess you have to decide that for yourself. But the interesting thing today is the age group that's getting divorced more than any other great age group is those in their 50s, which is, I think that's kind of odd. All right. So anyway, when you talk about women and divorce and marriage and all that, you have to talk about access to birth control. So of course, doctors and psychologists and sociologists are saying birth control methods are unnatural. Devices like the ones you see in front of you will leave a woman sterile or promote promiscuity, like, hey, I can't get pregnant, I might as well go have sex with everybody kind of attitude. So that is going to be part of this progressive fight too, that women should start having control over their own bodies as to whether to become pregnant or not. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Margaret Sanger is going to be at the forefront of birth control. So she said that it would eradicate poverty, give women choices, eliminate deaths due to home abortions. In this time period, and this is the truth of it, in this time period, you couldn't get an abortion. If you did get an abortion, it was probably done in a very violent way, like with knitting needles, horrible things like that. And very often the mother died as well. Women were also doing things, they were desperate enough to do things such as something called a belly flop. They would stand at the top of a staircase and throw themselves down the staircase onto their bellies to cause their body to abort this baby. And of course, they're going to die very often too. So Margaret Sanger is saying if we give women a choice and they never get pregnant in the first place, we're going to eliminate the deaths of these unwanted babies and the deaths of the mothers as well. So Margaret Sanger develops this pamphlet and she puts it in the mail. Well, of course, someone finds out about it, somebody in charge, and they charge her under something called the Comstock Law. The Comstock Law says that you're not allowed to use the mail to give out things that are considered illicit or uh, provocative or immoral. And so her pamphlet was considered all of those things. So she is arrested, she's put in jail for 30 days, but she still ends up opening the very first birth control clinic in America. At 80 years old, this woman convinced people to donate to her cause, enough for her to earn $150,000, and she used that money to start the development. She hired scientists to start the development of a birth control pill, and she passes away before it becomes to fruition. But Margaret Sanger is responsible for the pill. So it is developed with her money, and so that's why we have it today. So this is considered that time period of the very first wave of feminism. And here's where I want you to really understand what feminism is. Our society has made feminism and feminist something evil, and it isn't. All it is the advocacy of equal rights between genders. That's it. That doesn't mean that women are being sassy or hate men or anything like that. It just means women want to be equal. That's it. Are we? No. Even in the working world today, women only make 79 cents. I think it's up to 79 cents for every dollar that a man makes in average jobs. So we're still not not equal. But I want you to walk away from this knowing that feminism is not a nasty word. Being a feminist does not mean you're a horrible person, a horrible woman that hates men. Call me a feminist. Yes, I am a feminist. I'm advocating women's rights. I want to be equal to a man. Oh my God, did I just shock you? I hope I did. So, okay, I'm getting off my soapbox now. Let's move to the next topic. Let's talk about female suffrage. So we have three super prominent ladies. There's a lot more than that, but I want you to know these three super prominent ones. And they all came together under NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So make sure you know NASA. Important figures include Carrie Chapman Catt. You probably heard her before. And Carrie Chapman Catt ended up convincing the public not to vote for two anti suffrage senators. And this plan that she developed to convince the public of that became called the winning plan. So when she convinced enough people not to vote for those two anti suffrage senators, and the senators were not elected, other senators got scared, other politicians got scared and said, we better stop talking bad about female suffrage and let the ladies have it. So Carrie Chapman Catt is given a lot of credit for women actually getting the 19th Amendment, the right to vote in 1920. But I don't think she would have been able to do it without these other two ladies. Alice Paul was the most radical of the NASA women, and I'm going to let you watch a clip about Alice Paul. Alice Paul was willing to go to prison because she was picketing Woodrow Wilson, wartime president, and she was not going to give up. She wasn't going to stop it, and she got other women involved in it too. And as a leader, she and a couple other women with her were put into prison. And as time went on, more of these ladies ended up going into prison. Alice is their leader, so she's the one that's punished most often. And the thing that she decides women need to start doing is going on a hunger strike. And they are not treated well over the hunger strike. So let's take a look at that clip. Pretty realistic what happened to Alice Paul in prison. All right, so that hunger strike led to some pretty painful stuff, but Alice Paul never gave up. She publicized what happened to her, and I'm sure the guilt of it was also a huge, huge reason that women were given the 19th Amendment in 1920 and the right to vote. And we can't go through the voting rights for women without talking about Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, do not forget, she voted illegally and she was fined $100 for it. She went right up into the face of the judge and said, "I will never pay a dime," and she didn't. Susan was kicked out of her family. She was not entitled to the fortune of her family. She was alone in this fight. Her family thought she was nuts, and but she did it anyway. She voted illegally and told men how she felt about things. She wrote the 19th Amendment. She dies before it is actually put into action, but she's the author of the 19th Amendment. So Carrie, Alice, and Susan definitely are not the only three suffragists that got us that right to vote, but the culmination of their actions did a lot to get us over that hurdle and to get women the right to vote. So ladies, this is for you. Boys, you can not listen for a minute. When you're standing in line voting, I want you to think about these ladies. This is a war that went on for 72 years, and it was a war. It might have been a quiet war sometimes, but it was a war. Women jumped out of windows. Women threw themselves under horses. Women starved themselves in prison with the threat that we're going to force feed you and possibly fill your lungs with liquid and kill you. All of that to get the right to vote. And so I don't think that we know enough about these women, or that we promote what they did enough. Carrie, Alice, and Susan and women like them risked their lives and sometimes lost them just to get attention, just to get other women to say, you're right, we should be equal, we should have the right to vote. And so, ladies, when you stand in line and you're getting ready to vote, you need to feel proud of those women and thankful for what they did to get you to that spot to allow you to stand in line to vote. So, there you go. Off my soapbox once again. So, of course, men are not going to be super happy about women getting the right to vote. I love these pictures. I want the right to vote, but my wife won't let me. Voting, they're indicating, is going to make women masculine. You know, here's this woman that looks like a man. I love the suffragette poster. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. And notice the axe for Carrie Nation. So going a little overboard, don't you think? But the next one is my favorite poster. Well, this is what happens to the world when women vote. So, women are sitting around playing cards, smoking. The men are doing the women's job. Oh my God, this right to vote is going to turn our world upside down. How stupid is that? Just absolutely stupid. But didn't work anyway, so whatever. So here, I just want to make sure that you can put a face to a name. Carrie Chapman Catt, of course, here is up top. Don't forget she got the two senators to not be elected. Susan B. Anthony voted illegally, never paid her $100. And then Alice Paul, the radical that went to prison and tried to starve herself to death, true leader. But all of this culminates into the actions of this 24-year-old man named Harry T. Byrne. So it came down to a vote in Congress whether we actually give the women the right to vote or not. And it was a very close call. The day of the vote, if you did not think that women should have the right to vote, you were supposed to wear a red rose. And when the ladies counted the roses going into the room, they were not going to win the vote. They were going to lose it by one vote. So Harry T. Byrne is wearing a red rose. He again is 24 years old. He is the last one to vote, and so he's going to be the tiebreaker, but he's wearing a red rose. At the last minute before he walks up to cast his vote, he pulls a piece of paper out of his pocket and reads it. And when he goes to cast his vote, he casts in favor of women getting the right to vote. Now remember, he was wearing a red rose, so he was supposed to say no, but he says yes. The minute that he cast his vote, he ran up to the third floor of the building and hid in a closet, thinking that people were going to come and kill him. So, what was on the piece of paper? It was a note from his mother that she had slipped into his pocket the day of the vote. And the note said, "Be a good boy, remember your mother, I will be watching." And so he decided to change the way that he was going to vote. So, women got the right to vote when it came down to that moment. The real person who allowed women to have the right to vote is Harry T. Byrne's mother, who guilted him into voting for it. So there you go. Harry T. Byrne, no, he didn't get hurt. Nothing happened to him. Let's go back to the company towns. So you know how bad the company towns were. They were constantly having their pay reduced. They had to pay for everything. They had to rent their tools, the house they stayed in. They got paid in script. The mines were not safe. It was just a really bad life. And once you're in it, you can't get out because remember, you're being paid by script. So there was a woman by the name of Mother Jones who had a husband who was a miner and was killed. She had several sons who were miners. They were killed. She'd spent a lot of her life in a company town, knew how bad it was. So just take a look at the statistics here. For coal, any white worker in the coal, you've got at least 5 deaths per 1,000, 3,000 a year. And you got to keep in mind too that that usually happened in large numbers because you have cave-ins. So it's not one little guy fell in a hole and got killed. Usually it's 10, 20, 30 men got killed in a cave-in at one time. So you're talking about a major loss in a single company town every time it happened. Now look at the Chinese. Remember, the Chinese were the ones willing to do experimental things with dynamite. So their death certificates, death percentages are even higher. So Mother Jones is well aware of this. Now, she is one of those people that's not ever going to sit still in one place. She travels from place to place, and she went to Colorado in a town called Ludlow. The strikers, there were people striking at the Ludlow coal mine, and this was a mine that belonged to Rockefeller, of all people. So once they went on strike, of course, they can't live in his houses. They weren't going to be allowed to rent them. So they built a tent community right outside the mine. So this made them really easy targets for the local law enforcement. Now, Rockefeller didn't want it to be a public thing. So he's not going to call in militia. He's not even going to call in state military. He's not going to call in state police. He kept it very local and asked the local police to get volunteers to help monitor and keep these strikers from doing any damage and to try and end the strike. So between the strikers and the local law enforcement, there was a lot of kind of that hit and run kind of attacks. And with the strikers living in tent communities, it was really easy for local law enforcement to, come by the camp and fire a few stray bullets into tents and not even stay around long enough to see if they did kill anybody. And of course, on several accounts, they did. So it ended up being in this Ludlow community. They dug pits under the tents. So whenever somebody was in a tent, you were actually sleeping underground with a tent on top of it, and that way stray bullets couldn't get you. Now, the strikers aren't innocent either. Strikers are doing a lot of hit and run things too. And one evening, there was a group of local police officers that found one of their volunteer workers tied to a railroad track. And even he didn't know who did it to him. So he couldn't say, yes, it was the strikers, no, it wasn't. But of course, the local law enforcement is going to immediately believe that it is the strikers of Ludlow. So when they confront the strikers, the strikers get very upset at being blamed for something they didn't do. We don't know who really did it. Maybe they did do it, but they got upset enough that they split up, spread out, and attacked 40 different mining communities in the area. So Rockefeller's saying to the local law enforcement in Ludlow, Colorado, you've got to do something. We can't have this happening. I don't want it to be public. They're attacking other mines. Something's got to be done. And so they take matters into their own hand and they go into this tent community in Ludlow, Colorado, where 1,200 people live, miners and their families, and they start burning things down. And in the end, the count isn't completely accurate, but they are estimating about 100 people were killed. 55 of them were women and children who had probably been told by their husbands and fathers to go into the pit where you will be safe. They probably thought that if anything was going to happen, it would be gunfire, not fire. And so the people become trapped underground. And I'll show you some pictures in a minute. So this makes it very, very public. Woodrow Wilson will actually send in the militia and put the whole thing down. So it does end. So what does Rockefeller do? Rockefeller again does not want to make a big deal of this. He wants it to go away. So he makes sure that nobody is punished on either side, not the law enforcement nor the union workers who and the strikers who had gone out and done damage at other mines. Nobody is to be punished. He's not going to give them better pay or safer working conditions because that's what the strike was about in the first place, and he doesn't want them to win. So he does improve the housing, he improves the roads, and he says, here's your job. If you want it, take it. If you don't, get out. And he had them removed. So it was completely covered up, except for Mother Jones. Mother Jones was not going to let this story die. And so she travels the United States telling the story to everyone and anyone who was willing to listen. And so that's why we know about the story today, because she would not let it go. Now, she got arrested many times for the things that she said. She's a very in your face kind of person. And so her mouth got her arrested quite often. But her bringing this to the public light, she is very responsible for a lot of the laws that we have even today about safety in the mines and the way that company towns operate. So Mother Jones did make a difference in the lives of company town people. And here's a picture of what happened when they started setting the tents on fire. They actually took pictures of it. How horrible was that? But you see them starting to set the tents on fire. And here is one of those pits. Probably they didn't even know that the pit was there. The tent caught on fire. There's fire above you, and you're trapped. You can't go through the fire, and so the people that were in there end up dying of smoke inhalation. So just a horrible, horrible way to die. And I told you she had a big mouth. So here, I love this. I love this. Met a man in prison, asked him how he happened to be there. He said he stole a pair of shoes. And I told him if he stole a railroad, he'd be a senator. So that's how she talked to people. And she was not afraid to say that to anybody and everybody. And so she gets arrested a lot. But you got to love the woman. You got to love her. She wasn't going to let anybody get away with anything. Mother Jones. Progressives may not have been able to make the changes that they did without some type of media backup. So we're going to talk about a group of progressives that were writers, and they were called muckrakers. Now, muckrakers are people who expose the evils, especially in big business. So they're mucking up, or they're raking up the muckrakers, and exposing the evils. So it's going to start with a magazine called McClure's Magazine. And the three muckrakers that you see up here, Ida, Jacob, and Upton, were all published in McClure's magazines. And they came out usually monthly, and they didn't tell the entire story all at once. You would, like Ida wrote in it quite often, and it would be like a chapter a month. And so it kept people coming back to the magazine. And McClure's was not afraid to tell the truth, as long as people like Ida and Jacob and Upton could prove it. They wanted their reputation to be maintained. McClure would publish them. So let's start with Ida. Ida Tarbell's father was an oil guy, and you know that Rockefeller basically did away with all the little oil companies by bribing the railroads to only ship his goods, which meant that none of the other oil guys could get their goods to market, and they will end up having to sell to him. So Ida Tarbell's father was one of the little guys. He is run completely out of business. He lost everything. His partner ended up killing himself. Ida saw all of this happen. So, and when she grows up, she's going to be a really great writer. And she starts out writing history pieces. She did a pretty famous one on Abraham Lincoln. She did another one on Napoleon. And then she decides that she's going to find out what really happened to her dad. And so she goes to a guy by the name of Henry Rogers. And Henry Rogers had known Ida's father and really liked him, but he, for some very long circumstances, decided that he was going to actually work alongside Rockefeller, and he was Rockefeller's right hand guy for 25 years. So he knew the ins and outs. And Ida and Henry were both friends with Mark Twain. So Mark Twain is kind of stuck in the middle. But Henry Rogers allows Ida to come and interview him. She kind of made it sound like she was going to do a piece on him for McClure Magazine, but it would be one that made him look good. McClure Magazine wasn't all bad stuff. And so Henry Rogers was very, very candid. And Mark Twain kind of coached Ida on things to say and ask. Mark Twain also got Henry Rogers to give him some paperwork that really damned Rockefeller's reputation. And Ida publishes all of that. So she exposes the evils of Rockefeller to the world, and people were shocked. Didn't do a lot to really damage Rockefeller's business, but it definitely did a lot to damage his reputation, which he was super protective of. So Mark Twain. Jacob Riis, you're going to hear a lot more about later in the unit. He did realistic pictures of what people were living through in the cities as the Industrial Revolution moves in, the poor people, so how the other half lives. Beautiful artist, and we'll come back to him again, but it is exposing the evils of what industry did to people, not a specific industry, but industry, the Industrial Revolution as a whole. Upton Sinclair's focus, you've heard of him before. He wrote a very famous book called The Jungle about the meatpacking industry and exposed the evils of what was happening there. And I'm sure that you've read that horrible excerpt about the meatpacking industry from the book The Jungle. But make sure you know it starts with McClure's magazine, and that Ida, Jacob, and Upton were all three people who put their writings and their pictures in the magazine to expose the truths of things that were happening in society. All right, so there are presidents that are going to be pretty progressive, and the two that we are going to talk about, these are the two main ones, are going to be Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. Two very different guys, very different way of looking at what's happening in society. We're going to start with Teddy. So Teddy is a Republican, and you see he's going to have two terms as president, 1901 and 1909, and he referred to his presidency as the bully pulpit. And basically, a bully pulpit means he's in a wonderful position to tell people how he feels about things. Bully actually means good, and he used that word a lot. You know, this is a bully good piece of meat, or a bully good glass of wine. He used that a lot, and really bully means good, so he was saying it's good. So bully pulpit, make sure you know that for Teddy. His progressive ideas culminated in a thing he called the square deal, and he said that he wanted all Americans to have a square and fair deal in society. And so there are several things he's going to do. The first thing he's going to do is bust up a lot of those bad trusts. So he becomes the trust busting president. More than 40 trusts are broken up under him, and that's going to help the mom and pop stores stay alive. He also created the Department of Labor, which we still have today. So if you have a dispute with your boss, you can go to the Department of Labor and they will help you work it out. So he wanted, again, for everybody to get a square and fair deal. And so that's what his progressivism is all about. So let's look at some more ideas that he came up with under the idea of the square deal. And I know this sounds insulting, but if you can think of Teddy, his head kind of looks square. He had this big fat face, so that might help you remember square deal, square head, Teddy Roosevelt. Okay. He also came up with the Pure Food and Drug Act, and of course, that is going to be the FDA, which we still have today. And if you have any complaints about drugs, about food, that's who you would report it to. So he read Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, was completely disgusted by it, and so he came up with the Pure Food and Drug Act, which develops the FDA. Still very, very powerful today. He specifically wanted something done about the meat packing industry, and he didn't think the FDA was enough, so he created a separate and second form of watching the meat industry called the Meat Inspection Act. So this is after Gustavus Swift. Remember, now Gustavus Swift was not a bad guy. He was not a robber baron. He wanted to get meat to market fresh, and so his ideas end up it just becomes too famous too fast, and the meat industry gets out of his control, and so we end up with the FDA and the Meat Inspection Act. Specifically really over the meatpacking industry, and then the FDA starts monitoring other things later, like drugs and all kinds of food. The greatest thing that he did for America geographically is he created the national park system, and there he created five new parks, 190 million acres worth. And I'm going to show you some pictures of places that he found across America that he wanted to preserve, and they are some hot spots for tourism still today. So let's take a look at those. Crater Lake in Oregon is protected because of him. Isn't it beautiful? Wind Cave in South Dakota. I've been there. That is, oh my gosh, it is amazing. And you do feel the wind blowing through, and you hear it makes some crazy sounds, and it is a really neat place. If you ever get to go there, go for sure. Mesa Verde in Colorado, ancient place. And of course the Grand Canyon. So just a beautiful, beautiful place. So make sure you know Teddy for the square deal. Make sure you know the different things that he came up with, the five top things that he came up with to change society, protect society, and that is Teddy's form of progressivism. So you know that Teddy was president in till 1909, and then he is going to not run, and a man by the name of Taft becomes president. He's a Republican. So 1912, it's time to elect another president. It's time for another election. So Taft will run again for a second term. He's a Republican and he's the current president. Teddy decides he's going to run as well, still a Republican. Woodrow Wilson is going to run as the Democratic vote, and Eugene Debs is running on the socialist ticket. So, very interesting election. So, make sure you know we're not going to really talk about Taft or Eugene Debs. Debs, of course, is going to get the biggest socialist vote ever. But Taft is not going to get much of anything, and really in the end, neither does Debs. So it really comes down to Roosevelt and Wilson. Wilson is going to win, you see that, but Roosevelt comes in very close second. But these are the two platforms that they ran on. Roosevelt wanted something called New Nationalism. So, new nationalism basically meant that he was going to give more power to the federal government so that the federal government could make change in the social aspects of America. So, he was looking at ways to protect individuals and give individuals a better life, to clean up society, kind of thing. Woodrow Wilson wanted to run on the program called the New Freedom, and New Freedom is giving more power to big business, more power to the federal government to help the big business, because in his philosophy, if business is running well, then the entire country is running well. So Teddy Roosevelt's going to focus on the welfare of individuals. Woodrow Wilson is going to focus on the welfare of big business, and in his mind, that will in turn help out individuals and make life better overall. But Wilson's going to win. So let's look at a map to see how close it was. So again, Eugene Debs got 900,000 votes, but no electoral votes. So you can see how big of a vote Wilson got, and Teddy's going to come in second, but Wilson really ran away with it. 1912. And let's see what Wilson has to offer to the progressives. So he's going to serve from 1913 to 1921. So he does have two terms, just like Teddy did, unlike Taft before him. So he's going to use that program that he ran on, that platform that he ran on called the New Freedom. Again, remember it's supposed to help big business. So the first thing he does is create something called the Underwood Tariff. And this is going to actually reduce taxes for businesses. It's the first tax reduction on businesses since 1860. So this is a really big deal. And he said it wasn't just for big business, it was also supposed to help the smaller mom and pop shops. So he was his way of showing America that he wasn't all big business. He wasn't going to let the little guys go by the wayside. So this is supposed to help everybody. He also created or had passed the 16th Amendment. He pushed it through Congress. This is a progressive income tax. Now, we had income tax before in the United States during the Civil War. After the war, it was done away with. It came back again in the 1890s, and then it was done away with. But the 16th Amendment makes it forever. We will have our income taxed. So progressive means that you're taxed accordingly, to your income. That way everybody's not paying a flat tax, which that's kind of an argument in modern society. Should there be a flat tax? But the 16th Amendment, make sure you know, makes it forever. We will have taxes on our income. And if you haven't gotten a job yet and looked at a first paycheck, you're in for a really big surprise. Wait till you see what they take from you. He also focused on banking reform. He created something called the Federal Reserve, which of course still exists today. And the Federal Reserve is that group that sets what the interest rates will be for mortgages, loans, things like that. It babysits the economy. They are the group that decides when to put fresh money into society and when to take money out. So the Federal Reserve is a very powerful sect in the government. He also created the Federal Trade Commission, which meant there was not to be any false advertising. There is to be no bribery, and you could, under the FTC, you could go to jail for things like false advertising and bribery. So he's trying to clean up big business, help the little guy too. And again, that's part of the New Freedom. But that's not it. He did more. He also created the Clayton Antitrust Act. We've already talked about this. It replaced that Sherman Antitrust Act. But here's a little twist on it that we haven't talked about yet. The Clayton Antitrust Act did clean up the Sherman Antitrust Act, yes, but where Teddy went after trusts to break them up like a bulldog, Wilson said, we're going to let the Clayton Antitrust Act act as a referee. We're not going to go look for a trust, but we'll act as a referee if somebody comes to us and says, "Hey, there's a trust." Then we'll allow the government to referee, is it a trust or is it not. He's not going to go looking for them anymore. So that's a big difference between him and Teddy. So he's not going to break up 40 trusts like Teddy did. Now, he did come up with a federal workers' compensation plan. So if you're hurt on work at work, you get something for it. And so that sounds good. Now, the things that I've mentioned to you so far, there's some good and some bad to it. Like the referee thing, I'm not so sure about. But here's something that I'm not really sure why he even brought this up, but he allowed, notice this in quotes, individual state governments to work on their own reform. So he's saying, I want the states to have power, come up with their own individual plan when they're having money problems. But the problem with that is, it sounds great. The problem is, though, he also made it clear that the federal government was not going to give the states any money to fix anything. He was not going to provide them with a mechanism to make these new plans work. So really it was for nothing. You're telling the states they can solve their own problems but with no help whatsoever from the federal government. So number 7 is just completely a wash. I don't know why he even did that. Number 8 got him a lot of flack. Race relations was not his shining moment. He thought that if you kept black and white separate, it would protect the blacks. At least that's what he said. That's what he said. So he separated a lot of things that had not been separate before. The Navy was a big one. He went through and completely segregated the Navy and the post office. So completely segregated those two groups. And when he was questioned by it, because this is an era of progressivism, and this, he's taking things backwards. So of course he's going to be questioned about it. And this is his response. The purpose of these measures was to reduce the friction. It is as far as possible from being a movement against the Negroes. I sincerely believe it to be in their best interest. So he's saying, I'm going to separate them to protect them. You take that for whatever you want to take it for. I think that he was just trying to cover his butt because he was doing something wrong. But that's my opinion. And if you've had me before, you know that Wilson is not one of my favorite presidents. And again, he's the one that, wouldn't let the ladies have the right to vote and said bad things about them because they were striking and going against the White House during World War One. And I could go on forever about Woodrow Wilson. Not my favorite guy, but this race relation thing really gets in my craw. All right, so I need to get off my soapbox and we need to move on to the next topic, and that is going to be imperialism, I believe. I was right. It is imperialism. So here we go. Hopefully, you remember some things about imperialism from your last school year, but let's see what we can do as far as review. So let's go back to the Monroe Doctrine, which was done in 1823. It was actually John Quincy Adams who wrote it, but Monroe was president, so it became known as the Monroe Doctrine. And basically, it stated to the world the things you see here. America and North and South continents are closed to colonization. Any attempt at colonization would be an act of war. We are going to be big brother to Latin America, and the U.S. promises to stay out of European affairs, which of course we're not going to do. But the industrial age comes to be. So you've got too much of all these crops that we have here at home, and we don't have enough people to buy them. So we need new markets. So that's going to be a pressure that America is going through. European countries are increasing their navies. They're being militaristic, and we don't want to fall behind because that might make us sitting ducks. And of course, European powers are boasting that they are going out through the world and they're going to civilize and Christianize the heathens. And we don't want to sit back and not be a part of that because then we won't be the great America. So all of this is going to push us towards imperialism. Now, let's define imperialism just in case you've forgotten what it is. It's when a stronger country takes over a weaker one, and these are the types of things that come out of it. So, military influence, territorial acquisition, taking land from people, political and economic dominance. So, all of these are part of imperialism. It just depends, case to case, how much of an influence or how much of a dominance the country is going to use against this place they're imperializing. So let's look at some of the cases in this unit. Here's some basic facts of the first event that we're going to talk about, the first event of American imperialism, and it's going to take place under the name the Spanish-American War. Secretary of State John Hay, Hay, called it the Splendid Little War. It was our first overseas war, and we're going to win it very quickly, and we are officially a big dog on the planet. So 1898, it's only going to last 113 days. It is a two-front war, and we'll look at both fronts, what's happening in Cuba and what's happening in the Philippines. So American forces will be split, two-front war, and we still win it in 113 days. So pretty impressive. Make sure you know the players involved: President McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and George Dewey. Make sure you know them all. So here's a wonderful map of the Splendid Little War, and you can see again we're going to be fighting in Puerto Rico and we're going to be fighting in the Philippines. So you can see how far apart it is, and here we are splitting our troops for the first overseas battle and super successful at it. Let's look at how it starts. The Cubans approach America saying, "We want independence from Spain. Will you help us?" And America, of course, is going to say yes. We want their sugar cane. Cuba has some sugar cane fields that we would like to have access to. So it's not just us being a nice guy. We want something from them. So we did have Americans in Cuba, and we're going to have even more once the Cubans approach us about helping them get independence. So America decides to place a ship, a protective ship, off the coast of Cuba, and that ship will be known as the Maine. So again, the Maine is there as a protective measure for Americans in Cuba. Well, the Maine explodes, mysteriously explodes. The Spanish swear that they had nothing to do with it. Of course, America's going to say, well, it wasn't us. It's not going to be the Cubans because the Cubans want us there. So the Teller Amendment is created by McKinley, and in the Teller Amendment, basically it says to the world, we are going to join forces with the Cubans. America is going to join forces with the Cubans. We are going to run the Spanish out of Cuba and return Cuba back to the Cubans. So it also offers an alternative here for the Spanish. We're doing this. You can stay and fight, or you can go. Here's your one opportunity. And of course, the Spanish are going to say, no, we're not running. We're going to fight. So the Teller Amendment is President McKinley saying we will officially fight for the Cubans to get Spain out. Yellow journalism is going to be rampant in this war. Yellow journalism is basically a type of journalism that goes to the extreme. Sometimes it's for good, sometimes it's for bad, but it really does go to the extreme to get people's attention. So it's not always a complete lie, but it is a stretched truth. So yellow journalism, Spaniards search women on American steamers. You would not have a woman standing there buck naked being searched by men. That's not going to happen. The Cuban mother, crying over her starving child. That's not going to happen. So were women searched on ships? Yes, but not naked. Was there a problem with food in Cuba? Yes, but nobody was starving to death. So that's the kind of thing. You take this idea and you stretch it and make it seem life-threatening or really obscene or absurd, and that's yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is also used, even by our president, to keep the hatred towards Spain alive. And yellow journalism used that idea of remember the Maine, and you see the Maine sailors murdered by Spanish, and you have their tombstone down there. We don't even know if the Spanish really did it, and they make it seem like it was much more violent than it was. But remember, the Maine became the mantra of the day through yellow journalism, and it made the world basically hate Spain. And so we come out looking like the good guys through yellow journalism, and Spain looks like the bad guys because they blew up our ship and killed innocent people. Now we're going back in time a little bit. I know we just talked about Teddy Roosevelt as a progressive president, but in this time period during the Spanish American War, he's not a president yet. He's the assistant secretary to the Navy. And when he realizes that there's going to be a war, he quits his job to join a group or create a group really called the Rough Riders. They were a cavalry unit made up of his old college buddies. There were a lot of ex-cons in there. There were Buffalo Soldiers. There were Indians. So it's kind of this ragtag group of people that are going to go down to Cuba and get the Spanish out. So their plan was to get all this Spanish people off the land and into boats. So they chased them off the land, and one of the major battles that we'll talk about on the next slide is San Juan Hill. It's the bloodiest battle during the 3 months that our Rough Riders were in Cuba. But we'll come back to that. But that's one of the battles that got the Spanish off the land and into their boats. And then Teddy maneuvered a plan to get all the Spanish boats together in one spot and either sunk or beach them all. And in 3 months' time, the Spanish are out of Cuba. So super, super successful battle here. And you see Teddy right there in the center. So let's talk a little bit more about San Juan Hill and how this makes Teddy a hero. You know that we win in Cuba in 3 months, but let's look a little closer at Teddy. So here's men marching towards San Juan Hill, and you can see some of the Buffalo Soldiers mixed in there. So makes all these guys pretty famous. But in this battle, 1 hour, they fought for 1 hour at San Juan Hill, the bloodiest battle. Each side loses 200 men. The Spanish surrender when the Americans pull out their machine guns. So during this scuffle in this hour, somebody had finally brought the machine guns that Teddy had asked for, and so when the Spanish see that, they're like, "No, we're out," and so they run for their boats. But 200 men on either side died. So you've got 400 guys in an hour's time gone. What was Teddy's reaction to it? He said, "We had a bully fight." Remember, bully means good. So he said we had a bully fight and wasn't fazed by it at all. And that made him that rough, tough hero that people are going to love him for. And so don't forget, leader of the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt. They will take San Juan Hill. That's the real last stronghold of the Spanish. Get them into the ships, sink the ships, and voila, 3 months in, Teddy and his Rough Riders have gotten the Spanish out of Cuba. Woohoo! Success. So, you know, it's a two-front war. So while Teddy is over fighting in Cuba with the Rough Riders, the Philippines also needs to be defended. The Philippines want independent from the Spanish, and the guy in charge of the Philippines, the American man, is Commodore Dewey. Now, Commodore Dewey was ordered by Teddy Roosevelt before he gave up his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was ordered to attack Spanish ships in Manila Bay, right off of the Philippines. So, but before the attack starts, Commodore Dewey found Emilio Aguinaldo, who was a hero and a revolutionary of the Philippines. He had been put into exile for revolutionary acts. Dewey went and got this man out of exile and said, "If you help us, you know the Philippines, if you help us win against the Spanish, then when it's all over, we will allow you to be the leader of the Philippines." And so, of course, Emilio will say yes. Let's look at a little of the back history of the Philippines before we go any further. Okay, so 1521, the Philippines are taken over by Magellan. You know, the guy that tried to make it around the world, the first trip around the world. He ends up dying in the Philippines, but before his death, he did take the Philippines over. So the Philippines were officially a Spanish colony, and they name it after King Philip II, who was the husband to Bloody Mary of England. And so it set in motion that the Spanish now control the Philippines. So they were not good to the Filipino people. They did open schools, but they kept the Filipino people. They didn't really educate them. They didn't teach them Spanish, so they never really understood what the Spanish were going to do to them or against them. They cheated them out of land, they took their profits. It was not a good relationship. And this starts in 1521. But the people being kept in the dark and being barely educated, not well housed or clothed or fed, don't have a way to fight back. So finally, in 1895, Emilio Aguinaldo decides that he is going to fight back, and he does. And he does some serious damage to some of the Spanish headquarters, and the Spanish see him as a real threat, and so they threaten his family. If you keep this up, we will kill your family. And so Emilio said, "Okay, look, I give up. I will go to Hong Kong. You don't hurt me or my family. Let me go and live in peace in Hong Kong, as long as you promise to make some positive changes in the Philippines." And the Spanish government says, "Yes, you go, you live in Hong Kong, we'll make some changes." And so Emilio leaves and nothing changes. So George Dewey shows up under the order of Teddy Roosevelt, and when he gets there to get Spain out of the Philippines, he sees that the ships that the Spanish had parked in Manila Bay were pretty old, and he realized that their plan was to kind of protect the land from being invaded. They lined their ships up really close to the shore, and in the hope that American forces could not get past them. Well, they got past them. George Dewey, with the help of Emilio in 1898, he brings him back. Emilio knows the land. He takes Dewey into a kind of secluded port, and Dewey gets his men off the boat in single file. So they're not marching out in the open. They're doing it in single file, sneaking under the cover of darkness to line the beaches. And he tells his men, when they see us, they're going to start firing. You're okay. I've measured out the distance. They can't really hit you. Don't fire back until I tell you to. And so that's what the American soldiers do. They line the beach. When he tells them to, they start making noise so that the Spanish know that they're there. The Spanish ships fire on them. They're not close enough to actually kill any of them, but they're wasting their ammunition. And Dewey's pretty sure that they don't have a lot of it. So for a solid 30 minutes, he tells his men to just keep kind of walking up and down the beach, getting fired on, and don't fire back until I tell you to. So a half an hour in, then his men are told to start firing. They do. Their weapons are superior. Their weapons do reach the ships, and it's not very long before the Spanish surrender as well. So the Spanish are out of the Philippines. This one battle, okay, dawn to 1 p.m., it's over. And so the Spanish will be chased out of the Philippines. And now Dewey is supposed to hand leadership over to Emilio so that he can make a better life for his people. But let's see what happens. The treaty that ends the Spanish American War is known as the Treaty of Paris. Yes, you've heard that before. We really love that name, the Treaty of Paris. So let's see what happens under that treaty. Guam and Puerto Rico will both be made American territories. They still are today. Guam and Puerto Rico, the people born there are considered American citizens. They are allowed to vote in the primary elections for our president, but they can't vote in the final election. They don't have to pay taxes. So we asked them before if they want to be a state, and I think it's that tax thing that makes them say no. Now, if they move to America, They are American citizens. They're living on American soil. They will have to pay taxes, but they can do the voting thing. So right now, since then they've Guam and Puerto Rico both say we don't want to be a state. We'll get the benefits of citizenship, but that's it. So Guam and Puerto Rico from the Treaty of Paris, Spanish American War, are still our territory. We asked Cuba to sign the Platt Agreement, which basically said that we were allowed to intervene on if Cuba did any kind of an agreement with a foreign nation, we were allowed to look at that agreement and intervene and say no if we felt that it was a threat to us or to Cuba. And it also gave us some naval bases, including Guantanamo Bay, which we will talk about later, some of the horrific things that happen at Guantanamo Bay. But make sure you know that that is a result of the Spanish American War and the Treaty of Paris. So this Platt Amendment does honor that Teller Amendment that said we will kick out the Spanish and we will give Cuba back to the Cubans. We're not controlling them, we just have some say in their deals with foreign powers, and we have naval bases there. So for us, for Americans, we got some new territory. We got new trading partners. We're a big dog in the world. This is the first time we feel unified as a country since the Civil War. So we made out really well in the Spanish American War. But let's look at the Philippines. Don't forget, Dewey promised Emilio that he would have control of the Philippines. So Emilio publicly claims independence, names himself as the first president of the Philippines, but then finds out when he reads the treaty, that is not what the treaty says. The treaty says America gets control of the Philippines. Emilio is not even mentioned in it. So now we're going to have another war because of the Spanish American War and the Treaty of Paris. What happened to the Philippines, what it said about the Philippines, will start another war right on the heels of the Spanish American War, only this time it's going to be America versus the people of the Philippines. With the Spanish American War ending in 1898, see, right after that, because of that Treaty of Paris, the Filipino American War will begin in 1899. Now, we never call it an actual war. And I think it's just unbelievable that we put down the Spanish in two different places across the world in a little over 100 days. But these Filipino people, they wanted their independence so desperately. It took us 3 years to put them down. It is a absolutely brutal conflict. Teddy Roosevelt had a lot of direction about what was going to happen there, and one of the things that he said was very useful in getting the Filipino or any prisoners to give out secrets was something called a water cure. And basically, you lay a man on his back, you put something hard like a stone or a piece of wood behind his head so you can hold him really secure, and you put some kind of tube in his mouth. Very often, it was the barrel of a gun, and then you poured liquid across or down the tube into the man's mouth, into his nose, and you might know it as waterboarding. It's the same thing. Doesn't leave any physical characteristics on your body like you've been abused, but basically it is you're drowning the man on dry land. And most people said that, again, it's not this really bad thing, it tortures them, brings them to the verge of drowning. When they pass out, we throw them on their side, they puke up the water, they come back. Sometimes they didn't come back, and one of the men that was ordered quite often to use this water cure, an American man, said after the war was over, I was ordered to waterboard over 160 men and only 26 of them lived. So that's a huge statistic, but it was brutal on both sides. Americans went in and burned entire villages. I'll give you the statistics in a minute. More civilians died than soldiers. Even if you combine the American soldiers and the Filipino soldiers together, more civilians died. So just savage, savage stuff that we did there, because people were really basically running for their lives and not able to take care of themselves. Cholera and malaria ran rampant. A lot of Americans got it too. And there were, of course, food shortages everywhere because these people are trying to save their lives. They're not going to have time to farm. And so it is a very brutal conflict that we will win in 1902. So after 3 years of suffering, the Philippine American War will come to an end with us once again as the victors. So let's see what happens once the war is over. We decide to send in William Howard Taft. Now, remember, we've gone back in time, so this is before Taft is president, and he is made commissioner of the Philippines. And he referred to the Filipino people as our little brown brothers, which I find very insulting. He said that his campaign was a benevolent assimilation. Benevolent meaning kind. He was going to get them to assimilate to American ways. They did improve sanitation. We do have to give them that. They did open schools, but the schools only taught English ways. We're trying to kill off the Filipino ways, so the schools were only taught in English. And these poor people had no idea what the heck was going on. Between 1900 and 1902, there were 499 laws made in the Philippines. So this is while they're still at war. But 1900 to 1902, 499 laws were made. And so Taft has to come in and kind of clean up those laws, what's real and what's not. Filipino people didn't know what was expected of them. They really didn't. So it will not be a good situation for them. We do not treat the Filipino people right. We still have naval bases in the Philippines. They will not get their independence until 1946. We give it to them begrudgingly. And when we use the naval bases, we use the best of their land for our naval bases. The best farming land became our naval bases. So we don't have a wonderful relationship with the Philippines even today. Now, what happens to Emilio? Emilio is captured. He surrenders. He's allowed to leave of his own free will. He becomes a farmer. He stays in the Philippines, and he actually he died at like 96 years old, and he left everything to the Filipino veterans of that war, so that they could come to his home, which was a pretty big one by the time he died, and use it as kind of a retirement home, where they could have doctors and nurses take care of them. So he completely is out of the picture. But here's that death toll that I told you about. So 4,200 Americans, 20,000 Filipino soldiers. Look how many civilians. And this is because we went in and burned and pillaged, and basically were allowed to do whatever we wanted to do to win this war. So just a terrible situation, but we won, and we got our naval bases. Let's just move on. Let's move on to Hawaii. 1874, Hawaii was controlled by a king. You may not have known that. King Kalakaua was also known as the Merry Monarch, and he was very into making money, very open to bribes. He also allowed Chinese people to grow opium in Hawaii. Of course, you had to pay him for it. I think the highest bribe he ever charged was $250,000 for one opium field for two Chinese men who had approached him. So he made a lot of money off of it. But sugar was the way to go during his time. Sugar made a lot of money. So during his reign, four-fifths of the land was used for sugar plantations. And Americans got wind of this, and they decided to come to Hawaii and start taking up land. And they did it through bribery. They did it through trickery. And the people, of course, the local Hawaiians fought back. And the Merry Monarch, all he really wanted was money. See the castle that he has here? That's all he cared about. He wanted to build the castle. So whites were bribing him to come in and take over land, and he was letting it happen. And he was so oblivious to what was going on that he passed through something called the Bayonet Constitution. This was an American idea, and American plantation owners in Hawaii are the ones that pushed this through. And basically, it gave the whites more votes and the natives less votes. Basically, it took all their rights away, and it made him really nothing more than a figurehead. It took most of his power away. That bayonet constitution, just the name sounds evil, but Americans got away with it. We even got Pearl Harbor away from the king, and so that becomes our greatest naval base in the Pacific. And so he is not a very good king. He's not aware of what's going on at all. And then he's going to die in 1891, and his sister is going to end up coming to power. Let's see what she does. Queen Lulukalani was her name, and Queen Lulukalani was not an idiot like her brother. She pushed through a new constitution that basically removed the rights of all whites living there and gave the rights back to her people. But in 1893, with the help of the American sugar merchants on the island and Hawaiian sugar merchants, because she was costing them money, um, a group of Marines who were parked off the coast of Hawaii on a ship called the USS Boston were encouraged to help the sugar merchants under the leadership of a pineapple guy named Sanford Dole. So Sanford Dole, sugar merchants, white and Hawaiian, and the Marines from the USS Boston have a coup and they overthrow Queen Lalukalani. So she is removed or deposed in 1895. It only takes 2 years for this uprising to be an American success. So Queen Lalukalani is not hurt. Some myths say that they put her in a little boat and just set her in the water and watched her sail away. Others say that no, she lived on the island and she died an old woman at 80 and they never mess with her again. Who knows? But anyway, Sanford Dole becomes the president, not king. He becomes the president of Hawaii and he asks America to annex them, make them a state. And Cleveland said no. President Cleveland said no. He didn't think it was a good idea. Not everybody was on board with the idea of basically stealing this island from Queen Lalukalani. And so he says no. But when McKinley became president in 1898, the Spanish American War will break out. He's looking for naval bases, and so he says yes. And so, because of the Spanish American War, McKinley will annex Hawaii, and Hawaii will officially become a state. And this is Sanford Dole that you see off here on the side. And yes, it is the same Dole pineapple guy, same dude. All right, so that's Hawaii. Let's move on to China. Hopefully, you remember the incident with the spheres of influence in China. Let me give you a little bit of a review in case you don't. In Queen Victoria had open trade with China through opium. That was the one thing that China didn't have for themselves or invent for themselves. And so Queen Victoria of England got all the Chinese addicted to opium to the point where the Chinese government made a treaty with her to stop the imports of opium and they had to give her a lot of money. And so China didn't have any money after that and they ended up having to allow foreign nations to come into their country and take over spheres or sections. They leased them, rented them, um, and it was changing everything in China. And not everybody in China was happy about this. Most people probably were not happy about it, but one specific group will rise up and say no. And that group is known as the Boxers. You might remember them as the Harmonious Fists. But most often they're known as the Boxers. And these Boxers begin a rebellion and they're pretty smart. They go to the city of Beijing. You see the picture here. Beijing was had a section of the city that was walled off from the rest of the city, and that's where these very important people who were part of these spheres would stay whenever they visited. So you're talking kings, queens, cardinals, really, really important people stayed behind that wall in Beijing. They think that wall is going to protect them, but the Boxers use it against them, and to them, that wall creates a prison. And so they line the walls and kidnap everybody behind the walls of Beijing, and they announce to the world, we will not release any of these people. And remember, they're super important people. They say we won't release any of them until the Western devils agree to leave our country. So the Boxers do hold off. Military groups from every country you can think of had shown up to get their people back. So it's a miracle that the Boxers held on for 3 months, but they did. At the end of 3 months, all the Boxers are killed, and it looks like the world is ready to tear China apart. China will not be China anymore. And so America decides to come to the rescue. America had not been allowed to have a sphere. China didn't like us. You should know why. We referred to Chinese as the yellow peril, and we did not want Chinese people in America, but we wanted a portion of China. So here's our chance. We're going to send in Secretary of State John Hay. You've heard his name before, the splendid little war guy. John Hay, under the orders of President McKinley, it goes in to save the day. And basically, he talks all these countries into not tearing apart China, and he develops multiple pages and multiple versions of treaties where China, will make whatever promises they have to not to be torn apart. And that culmination of agreements and treaties becomes known as the Open Door Notes, and that is done in 1899. So America is allowed a sphere if we want one. Open door means anybody can have a sphere if they want one. And this really makes us a hero to the world. We saved China. We settled everybody down. We convinced everyone that destroying China was the wrong thing to do. China makes everything for us then and now. So it would have been dumb to tear China apart, but it will be John Hay, an American, who settles things. And so we are, we've won this war against Spain. We're the good guys in that situation. Now we came in and we saved China. We're a good guy in that situation. So we are really looking like the big dog and the good guys to the world here, except for the Filipinos. So McKinley is very imperialistic. We've talked about a lot of places: Spanish American War, Hawaii annexation, all of that stuff, China. So America's being very imperialistic under his leadership, but he's going to get killed in 1901. He was at a kind of an art opening, and he was waiting in the receiving line, very, very public place in New York. And this guy by the name of Leon Cholgas, he was an anarchist, and he was at the reception as well. And he walked up to McKinley with a handkerchief wrapped around his right hand. And McKinley thought that he had a wound or disfigurement that he was covering up. And so he went to reach for the man's left hand. He was going to shake hands with him. And Leon grabbed his hand and shot him twice. Now, the first bullet ricocheted off of McKinley's belt buckle, but the other one went in, pierced a few organs, landed in his spine. So, of course, they immediately grab Leon, take him into custody. McKinley is taken to the hospital. They operate, they can't find the bullet, and he ends up dying. I think it was 8 days later, from gangrene. He got blood poisoning. So, almost immediately, Cholgos is going to be executed. And you see the filming here, or the picture of it here. Supposedly, Edison actually filmed this, but I couldn't find it anywhere, so I don't know if that's true. But at least that gives you an idea of the time period. Edison is around, Thomas Edison is around, if it is believed that he could have possibly filmed it. So did he? I don't know. But does it stop imperialism? No, because who is the guy in the wings waiting to step in the minute that McKinley dies? It's going to be Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt will become president with the death of President McKinley. Teddy is a very different kind of leader. You've heard a lot about him already, but let's see what he does as president. So his foreign policy is speak softly but carry a big stick. So basically, if these countries don't do what we want them to do, we'll beat them over the head. And so Teddy doesn't take any guff from anybody. He adds to that Monroe Doctrine that says we are closed, don't mess with Latin America, we're the big brother, we will stay out of foreign affairs. He adds to that Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt Corollary. So this is an attachment to that Monroe Doctrine, and the Roosevelt Corollary basically says if foreign powers do anything to endanger us, and that means trade too. So if you do anything to endanger us, we're coming to get you. We will come take you down. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a direct threat to America, North or South America anymore. It's if you're interrupting our trade over in China, we're going to come take you down. It's an act of war. So Teddy wanted our military, our navy specifically, to be very visible across the world. And so Teddy puts together something called the Great White Fleet. So let's look at some pictures of the Great White Fleet. He did take all the ships and paint them white, as you can see, so they were really super easy to see. And he made sure that the smoke coming out of them was super, super dark. Great for air pollution, right? In that time, we didn't care about that kind of stuff. So it was a huge contrast between the black smoke and the white ship. And basically, their job was just to travel around the world, not really intimidating people, but to just be a presence. And every port that they pulled in, they were welcomed with a hero's welcome. welcome. We became the watchdogs of the world, very visible. I believe this is, oh gosh, I can't remember what city it is. It's not New York, but the one down there on the bottom is a good example. This is an American city, and I can't remember which one, but it's an American city welcoming the Great White Fleet. And this is how they were welcomed across the world. So this just happens to be an American welcome. But regardless of what country they landed in, that's how they were welcomed. They were heroes of the world. So his Great White Fleet was a success. It made us a presence, a world presence to be reckoned with. Teddy was pretty smart about things like that. But Teddy was not just going to worry about what's happening on the European side of the world or even the Asian side of the world. He's worrying about Latin America as well. And in 1903, Colombia, who is in control of Panama at the time, that's their colony, Colombia hires a French company to build a canal. And so this canal, of course, is going to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific. It is going to be worth a lot to whoever controls it because it's going to cut travel down greatly. The problem is that the French succumb to yellow fever. They've never had to deal with it before, and so they're not going to be able to finish building it. So America goes to Colombia and says, we'll give you $10 million if you allow us to build the canal. And Colombia said, how about you give us 25 million? And so instead of dickering back and forth over this, Roosevelt goes to the Panamanians and says, "You know what? Colombia is not a very good mother. If I give you support, would you revolt against Colombia and I'll make sure that you get your independence?" So of course the Panamanians say yes. These are actually pretty peaceful people. So to convince them, that made Teddy pretty good at trickery. So Roosevelt backs up the Panamanians, and of course, with the help of America, the Colombians will lose Panama. So Panama signs a treaty with the United States allowing them to build the canal, and they give them, for that, they do have to give them the $10 million like they promised Colombia, but for $10 million, which is paid in yearly installments of I think $250,000, America was given a 10-mile strip called the Canal Zone. And so that belonged to us. We were in control of it. So we gave them the money. This makes us a super controversial figure across the world because did we have the right to go in and start a fight between Colombia and Panama? I can't answer that question. But let's look at the building of the canal. Here's some wonderful pictures, and you can see how it's going to attach the Atlantic to the Pacific, how many miles of travel it's going to save people. So militaries will become more powerful because of it. It's going to save lots of money. But I love this picture. There's so many pictures out there of Teddy actually sitting in the equipment helping to build the canal. I mean, he was a big guy, and he liked the rough and tough stuff, and so he was not gonna miss out on the building of the Panama Canal. And I actually have a film, of course I do, I have a film clip to show you about the Panama Canal and how cool it is. So take a minute and watch that, and then we'll come back and talk about the results of this Panama Canal. So as a result, U.S. becomes Panama's protector. Of course, we're going to because we want to have access to that canal forever. The U.S. saves time, money, increases military power. I already told you about that. But it also shows that good or bad, we are exerting our dominance in the world more and more and more. That could be a good thing. We saw the Great White Fleet as a good thing. People wanted us to be the world protector, but shoving Colombia out of the way to take control of the Panama Canal also made us look like a bully. So Teddy's a controversial president. Do we consider this to be good leadership, or do we consider it just that he's another bully on the playground? So you got a lot of cartoons like this. You see Teddy himself digging the canal, and he's throwing the dirt on the capital of Colombia, Bogota, the capital of Colombia. Pictures came about all over the place with this kind of stuff. So I don't know. You decide for yourself. Was it the right move for America financially? Sure. But did we have the right to do that? So you decide. So Teddy does a lot of things while he's president. he is seen as a bully by many. But then comes along William Howard Taft. You probably remember Taft, if you remember his name at all, as the president who got stuck in the bathtub because he was so big. And you saw the picture of him on the Caribou in the Philippines. He was the guy sent in to take care of the situation with the Philippines after the war. But let's see what he does as president. So he is going to be the guy who tries to settle problems in Latin America and Asia, money problems. He thinks that he is going to develop a way to bring them out of poverty and turn them into successful trading partners for America. So they will win, we will win. And so instead of going in with the big stick like Teddy did, he went in with money and he encouraged the United States businesses to invest in places like Latin America and Asia, send factories over there, give people jobs, bring them out of poverty, and then they will start buying American goods. And so this program became known as substituting dollars for bullets. So we're not going into Latin America and Asia shooting them up and saying, "Give us this." We're sending them money, a means to make money. This begins that process of moving American businesses out of America. So Taft doesn't know it, but he's sending us down a very slippery slope where, we don't have a lot of business in America anymore. He's the guy that starts that, but he doesn't realize, you don't know what's going to happen when you make a plan like this. He's trying to do a good thing. And part of his goals are what you see here in front of you: maintain that open door with China, stability in Latin America and Asia, bring them out of poverty, we'll make money too, everyone will be happy. That's his plan. Now it does work at first. US starts making a lot of money because it is good for us to have cheap labor in foreign countries to make the same things we were making here in America at, 10 times more the price. So at first it's like, wow, this is really, really great. Where our goods are cheaper, but then we started to realize, but Americans are losing our jobs. We're sending money to foreign nations and we're not really getting it back. And so over time, this idea of dollar diplomacy, substituting dollars for bullets, ended up hurting everybody involved. The countries that we opened the factories in were not prepared. Workers didn't understand what was expected of them. And so we can't go over there and babysit. So the guys in charge of the factories were mistreating the locals, cheating them out of pay, beating them, doing bad things. So everything just kind of got out of control, and dollar diplomacy was not a good thing in the end. It was a nice effort. It was a good, humane plan, but it just backfired, didn't work. So let's get back to that Taft uh, idea that he got stuck in the bathtub. That isn't true, and the reason I know it's not true is because before he even took up residency in the White House, he had a bathtub specially made for him. It's the biggest bathtub in the world. It literally weighed a ton, 7 feet long, 41 inches wide, that four men could sit in comfortably. So no, he never got stuck in the bathtub, not ever. But let's go back to what the unit is all about. What does all this imperialism do to America? It gives Americans a severe case of jingoism. Jingoism is that extreme idea that we are the only people that should be here, that America is American born people are the only good people in America. This is not just an American thing. Whatever country you're from, if you have jingoism, it's extreme, extreme love of your country, not just nationalism, but to the point where you would kill somebody that said something bad about your country. And so all of these things are going to end up culminating, of course, into World War I. So we're going to skip World War I as far as a lecture, and you're going to have something to do. Most people know World War I so well. I'm just going to give you an activity on your own to do World War I, and you will share it with your classmates. So this video is going to skip over World War I, and I'll meet you in the 1920s.